And I'm going to talk about the cycle of integration, but also kind of introduce the new publication to you at the same time. So I'm structuring this little talk a bit around the structure of the publication itself. I'm just going to start with some of the things that are particularly important to me in thinking about what integration is. And as you can see, all of them are taking it above the level of mechanics. Integration is, first and foremost, a mindset. The way the organisation thinks. It's a cultural thing. It's the way we work. It's not just about outputs and outcomes. Lots of organisations, in fact we were just talking about this on the table down the front here, lots of organisations will say, well, we're integrated, we collaborate really well, there's lots of consultation and we work really well together. And immediately you have the confusion. There's a big difference between collaboration and integration. Collaboration just means that you work well together, you have good colleagues, you find ways of working in crisis situations or urgent situations, and you work well together. That's not integration, that's just working well together. Integration is something that happens at a higher level. It's a principle which is backed up by rather than led by process. So the mistake that some organisations make is they say, it'll be fine, we'll introduce some new processes and then we'll all be nicely integrated. You need process, but it's based on a principle. It's strategic and tactical, and perhaps most important of all, and I'm going to say some more about this in a second, it's derived from this. Can you have what's a four when it's a holy trinity? A holy quadrilogy of brand, strategy, narrative, and audience. Everything should derive from those four things. Now, in the new publication, it talks about 5 interrelated factors, which are the key to embedding an integrated approach. And it uses a circle to acknowledge that the process isn't linear. Nothing ever quite happens in the nice sequential way that we would like it to. But that's not a reason for not doing things. You can jump in at any one of these 4 or 5 points on the diagram, and different organisations will find it's right to start at different points. And as Vicky says, if you're waiting for the perfect moment to arrive, it never will. You have to think about what's the right place for you now. Where on that diagram would you think you are as an organisation at the moment, and you could perhaps make a start. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these. So organisational structure and culture, corporate strategy and brand, impact and evaluation, integrated marketing campaigns, and audience. So let's start with corporate strategy and brand. So I've started to say this already. Successful organisations ensure the foundations of their brand, vision, mission and values, or the equivalent, always stay linked with strategic objectives and goals. And if you, that is to say you collectively, each part of the organisation, each department, each team, start with your strategy, start with your brand, and I would add the narrative that is connected to those two things, if that's guiding everything you do, you will always be achieving a level of integration. Integration starts at the top in both the sense of strategy, brand and narrative, and in terms of the leadership of the organisation. That's where it all begins. The other thing we were just talking about on this table is too often we try to broach the subject of integration by starting at the wrong end. We start at the end of why isn't this working day to day? Why doesn't this feel like an integrated organisation? We can't make our colleagues in delete as applicable comms, fundraising, policy, campaigns understand why it is that we need to be better integrated. It's the wrong place to start. You start at the top and you start thinking about what are our shared strategy objectives? What are we all trying to achieve? What does our brand guide us to do? What does our narrative tell us that we should all be saying? What are our shared audience objectives? Consultants like diagrams. I've been a consultant for a little while now, having, as Vicky said, moved out of working in-house in the sector. Everything always boils down to a 4-box diagram, a Venn diagram, or a triangle. I'm in my blue triangle phase. So this is my current favourite diagram, but it kind of sums up what I was just saying. Every organisation should be built on those 3 pillars of brand, strategy and narrative. They all feed each other. None of them are static. You review your strategy on a regular basis, and that informs how you think about your brand, and that modifies the narrative that you have to tell the world, and you could have that conversation starting at any point. But all of them are absolutely about what you're doing with your audiences, saying to your audiences. You could say audiences and beneficiaries to be absolutely complete there. And you could say that also includes internal audiences, so there's a cultural element to that. And sitting in the middle of all of that is the essence of who you are. If you are a properly integrated organisation, then people will always be able to feel, touch, sense that essence in every piece of communication that you do. But it starts here at the highest level: brand, strategy and narrative. Of course, in an ideal world, it would be a straight line. You'd start with your strategy. That would inform and fit neatly with your brand. You'd be able to derive from that a nice, coherent narrative, and that would drive the integration process. But, of course, it doesn't work like that. Things get reviewed, refreshed, and you have to update things as you go. You have to shift as you go. Organisational structure and culture. So the big question: how do you convince colleagues and persuade your management team? Well, we've already hinted at this in talking about strategy, because ideally, because the people responsible ultimately for the strategy, making sure the strategy exists, making sure the brand is there and understood, and making sure there's a coherent narrative, is your CEO and your senior managers. So they need to buy into the approach, endorse the approach, live the approach. That's where it happens. That's what makes it happen. We as practitioners day to day can work as hard as we like, but if you're not getting the support and the backing from the senior people in the organisation, then that ain't going to happen. If they champion it, things start to change. So, is there an easy answer to that? How do you do that? No, of course it's not easy. It's a constant. It's a painting the fourth bridge. It's constant persuasion. It's constant reiteration. It's never giving up on it. But in the end, what will give confidence is success, and demonstrating the value of a more integrated approach. And I'll come on to that in a second. I wanted to just say a very quick word about the pros and cons of integrated planning groups, because which includes senior managers. Because this is one kind of tactic, if you like. It's a sort of a structural, practical thing that you can do to aid the process of integration and to get a higher level of buy-in. And it's not saying it's all about introducing more meetings, but it is saying there are some key people who need to always be talking together about the key strategic communications, marketing, brand objectives. They will be slightly different in different organisations. Vicky kindly referred to the NSPCC. The combination there that worked very well was myself as the Director of Comms, the Director of Fundraising, the Director of Policy, and the Director of Operations, as it was called, the Director of Children's Services. That group of four took responsibility, had delegated responsibility from the CEO to take all of the big decisions about strategic marketing activity. By definition, all of the major work that was done, and then gradually over time, not just the big activity but the ongoing activity, became more and more integrated, because the buck stopped with them and they were driving the process. I'll only add one more point, which is it is really important that if you're an organisation with an operational element, that the operational director, the person responsible for that, is part of it, part of that decision-making process. Embrace them into it, rather than, as I know we all do it sometimes, do that, and they're never going to get it. They don't understand comms. They absolutely need to be inside the tent. Trial campaigns. Integration can be big and scary if you think you have to go from zero to full integration in one step. You don't have to do that. In fact, it's often advisable to do precisely not that, to choose something manageable, small, containable, that you can use as a demonstration model, as a bit of a show home. Look, here's something that works. Here's how we added some value by making a particular activity more integrated. It's the microcosm that shows why we should be doing this in everything that we do. So use a couple of examples. I see a couple of old RSPCA colleagues in the room, so I shall mention RSPCA Week. While I was there, we started to try and improve the level of integration of work across the RSPCA. RSPCA Week is something that happens every year anyway. It was already there in people's diaries. People recognised it was an opportunity. It had been for years primarily a focus on local fundraising activity. We started to look at how we could enhance the value of that week by adding other activities around it. It was a relatively low effort example that we were able to use to demonstrate the value of integration. Another one that you might think about is a direct marketing thing. There's a direct marketing program that goes on in most charities all through the year. Take one that has a particularly interesting approach, interesting message, and start to build out from it. How can we enhance this by having some local media activity around it, by having some internal communications activity around it, and let's see whether that actually improves the response rate and gives us some extra message delivery opportunities around that particular campaign. Those kind of things, with relatively contained sets of objectives, can be used as really good examples then to senior people in the organisation of, look, if we can do it on this, then we can do it here, and we can do it here. Just a little diversion to talk about some useful tools. Things you might think about using to help the process of integration. These are all in the guide in more detail, so I'm only going to say a one-liner about each one. Think about using responsibility matrices, variously known as RACI or RASCI, which means responsibility, accountability, consultation, inform, and the S in the RASCI is support. So if you prefer that version, it's which people are going to provide support to this activity. Shared pen portraits, regular communications audit, so use the opportunity every now and again to go around the whole organisation and check to what extent there is coherence, common message delivery, etc. Use that as a platform for having the conversation with people. Clear brand model, make sure you actually have got that in place, your vision, your mission, your values. The brand story or narrative. I'm a bit narrative obsessed at the moment. I think it's the bit that is missing in so many organisations. People, on the whole, get the need for strategy and a clear brand framework. But having that one clear set of words, which is your benchmark, this is who we are and why we are. This is what we feel and why we feel. This is what we do and why we do that rather than something else. This is why we do this set of stuff and other people do that set of stuff. And it's the thing that absolutely defines you and from which everything else, in terms of your communication, derives alongside your brand and your strategy. Storytelling framework, so break up your brand story or your narrative into some key theme areas. So I'm currently working with Alzheimer's Society, so we would be looking at breaking up the Alzheimer's Society narrative into care, research, policy, community engagement, and breaking down the messages into those groups and making sure that everybody has a shared understanding of those messages. A message matrix, so break down that brand story even further and think about how you translate it for particular audiences. How does that turn into messaging for particular audiences? Sets of standard descriptors, clear brand guidelines, an integrated campaign plan. So here you're starting to get a bit more sophisticated. Even at quite low level, make sure that you are, from the very beginning, collectively planning your campaign. You have one brief. You have one set of objectives that are shared. You have one set of audience outcomes that are shared. You have a campaign proposition, a case for support, supporter actions, etc., etc. All of those things that exist for the whole campaign, not here's the fundraising ones, here's the comms ones, and here's the campaigning ones. A little bit about impact and evaluation, and then I'm going to say a bit about audience, and then that's me done. Impact and evaluation, absolutely key part of the integration process. There's a full presentation later on about evaluation. So all I'm going to say is that just like every other aspect, you need to agree this together at the beginning of the process for an individual campaign or at the beginning of the year for a whole strategy. Yeah? So when you're working out who to talk to, what channels to use, what it is you're going to collectively measure, what is channel or audience specific, that's a shared set of understanding of what is the purpose of this activity or of this strategy or of this program. And if you're all using the same planning and evaluation model, you can choose which channel is the most effective for achieving which part of the objective with which audience. If you're interested in this stuff, there's any number of models, and I'm sure when this afternoon's speaker talks about it, they'll refer to some as well. I particularly like one called CODAR, C-O-D-A-R. If you want to check it out, Google it, have a look at it, but there are many others as well that work for different organisations. Audience, absolutely key. Understanding, targeting and engaging your audience is key to integration. And despite years of analysis and trying to move away from this, organisations still fall back on their own designations, their own categorisations as the basis of their thinking, rather than starting from where the audience are. So how we categorise people is just for our own administrative purposes. People outside of the organisations don't categorise themselves as a medium-level donor, a legacy pledger, a campaign. They're not. They're just people who want to support the cause. But we fall into the trap of doing all of our planning that way round. So again, this is a plea for thinking about audiences in a shared way. Nobody owns audiences, shouldn't, in organisations. if anybody owns an audience at all, and philosophically there's quite an interesting argument about whether anybody owns an audience, because we own ourselves as an audience, don't we? But if anybody owns an audience, it's the whole organisation that owns it, and therefore all information about audiences should be shared. There should be common understanding, common access to audience insight, audience data. All of that should be shared. If people are being spoken to by lots of different teams, they want to feel consistency. They're not bothered about who it is that's contacting them and where that's coming from. They're just being contacted by the organisation. So it's all about working with shared audiences. More charities are identifying and segmenting key audiences, using sort of organisation-wide segmentation models. CRM is, everybody is looking at CRM. Not every organisation can afford expensive, sophisticated systems, but the approach can be common across any kind of organisation. And just my final slide, and I suppose the message I'd want to leave you with is, in the end, bring everything back to your strategy, your brand, and your narrative, and by implication, therefore, to your audiences and your beneficiaries, because it's for them that the brand, the strategy, and the narrative exist. Slightly bizarrely, I'm now quoting myself as my final slide. This is a quote in the guide attributed to me, but actually it felt like the right message to leave with. So remember that whatever you're trying to achieve with a particular audience at a particular point in time, your deeper purpose as an organisation should absolutely be encapsulated in your strategy, your brand, and your narrative. If you keep going back to that, it will help you to achieve integration. That's it. Thank you very much.